28 years ago tomorrow, our founder passed away. So I thought it might be nice to hear his words tonight. He founded the Philosophical Research Society in 1934. He built our magnificent library in 1936. He built this auditorium in 1959. And when he spoke here, people were standing along the walls. It was full. And we still carry on his vision today for what the place is. And we do it through a university now as well. And it's really, I think it's so important, and that's why I'm so happy to be here doing the work with my colleagues that we do, which is find wisdom wherever you can. Don't limit yourself, right? Look at any tradition, philosophical, religious, literary, scientific. Find it anywhere and everywhere and bring it to people and build community with it and talk through it and use dialogue to get there and be kind and generous and smart and critical along the way. So when he dedicated this building in 1959, this is what he said, and it just really moved me, especially today. It is a great and solemn responsibility to be thus the center of a purposed endeavor. But I would like to say that actually I am not any such center at all. I'm only working with you, trying in my own way, just as you are trying, to do something that my heart and soul tell me we all want to have done. We do not want this in any way to be a personal loyalty, but a loyalty to ideals. Our own staying in this world is but short. Others must come after. And we want for those others only one thing, not that they shall continue anything I have done. Not to be true to me, but to be true to truth, to be true to principle, to correct the errors that I have made, to go further than I can ever go. Manly Hall. Isn't that great? And so, let's do that tonight with Simone Weil. And we'll be drawing mostly from a book called Waiting for God. I doubt many of you know Simone Weil. Anybody? I know Satinder encountered him. David Orr. Michael, of course. Very good. Well, you're in for a treat. I think she's fascinating and unique individual in the history of the world, but especially intellectual history, and not just as an intellect, but as a seeker who sought with pain and reflection and compassion, as you'll see. This is our passage tonight. What we do is we take a passage from the world's wisdom traditions or literary traditions or whatever, and we read it, and then I zoom way out. I'll give you some context to build around it. We'll come back to the passage, and you'll have the context now to apply to the passage, and basically we get to revel in these great passages of literature and sacred texts and philosophy and theology, etc. The beauty of the world is the mouth of a labyrinth. We could probably spend all night just on that sentence. The beauty of the world is the mouth of a labyrinth. Let me just read it. I'm so excited to get to the unwary individual who on entering takes a few steps is soon unable to find the opening, worn out, with nothing to eat or drink, in the dark, separated from his dear ones and from everything he loves and is accustomed to. He walks on without knowing anything or hoping anything, incapable even of discovering whether he is really going forward or merely turning around in the same spot. But this affliction is as nothing compared with the danger threatening him. For if he does not lose courage, if he goes on walking, it is absolutely certain that he will finally arrive at the center of the labyrinth. And there God is waiting to welcome him. No, that's not what she said. And there God is waiting to eat him. Later he will go out again, but he will be changed. He will have become different. after being eaten and digested by God. Afterward, he will stay near the entrance so that he can gently push all those who come near into the opening. So if you've ever felt like a piece of shit, Simone Weil says you're right where you need to be because God has digested you. What an amazing woman. André Gide called her the patron saint of all outsiders. I think that's probably the best description. Trotsky called her the melancholy revolutionary, my kind of revolutionary. Charles de Gaulle called her crazy, the president of France, and you'll see why. She was born in Paris, February 3rd, 1909. And she was, as Rebecca Roselle Stone says, from a Jewish family, assimilated, secular, bourgeois French childhood. She had that kind of childhood, both cultured and comfortable. So she has no business doing what she ends up doing, as you'll see. Leslie Fielder, you may know if you study literature, famous book, Love and Death in the American Novel. Pretty famous literary critic. He does the introduction to the most famous edition of Waiting for God. And he says this: "We have all turned to her with the profound conviction that the meaning of her experience is our meaning, that she is really ours. Few of us, to be sure, would find nothing to dissent from in her religious thought. Fewer still would be capable of emulating the terrible purity of her life. None could measure himself without shame against the absolute ethos toward which she aspired. And yet she does not seem strange to us, as other mystics and witnesses of God have seemed strange. For though on one side of her life touches the remote mysteries of the divine encounter, on the other, it is rooted in a world with which we are familiar." That's exactly right, as you're going to see. She is otherworldly and so rooted in this world that it hurts. She was born in 1909. In 1915, she tells her family that she will no longer eat sugar because the soldiers at the front do not have sugar. What is she, 6? Refuses to eat sugar in, solidarity with the soldiers during World War I, right? Were you thinking stuff like that at 6? I wasn't thinking anything. She would refuse to wear socks because they didn't have socks. Declared herself a Bolshevik at 10. So I guess she knew what a Bolshevik was at 10 and liked it. She was proficient in ancient Greek by 12 years old. I'm still waiting on that for myself, to be proficient in ancient Greek. She came across the Bhagavad Gita at one point, and I think she was a teenager, and she said, well, this seems interesting, let me read it in its original. So she learned Sanskrit as a teenager, as one does. And she had a dark night of the soul at 14. Now, this is not your typical dark night of the soul that we all have at 14. This is different. The problem, well, I don't want to psychoanalyze Simone Weil. That's been done, and it's not that productive anyway. But there are some things we should know and take into account. Her brother was a mathematical prodigy, slightly older than her, and beside him, she was younger than him, and she felt not as smart as him. And her father would remind her of that. He was a mathematical prodigy, and she was not. As you'll see, she had her own genius. But she did not get the recognition that he did. She did posthumously. She did after her death. But she was convinced she did not have any intellectual talent. A visitor was at their home once and said to her mother, and Simone never forgot these words. She's looking at the two children and she says, "One is genius itself," the woman said, pointing to the boy, and then indicating Simone, "The other is beauty." Well, I think that really troubled her. And isn't that a very interesting anecdote for the history of Western culture? Men are smart, women are pretty, right? And ever it shall be. She was not going to let that stand, right? And she didn't. She, during the Spanish Civil War, she decides to go to Spain and fight with the Loyalists. It was a terrible idea. She was, for one thing, farsighted, and they were convinced, sorry, I skipped ahead. They were convinced that she was going to get them killed. And there's a story I'll tell you in a minute. Sorry, I skipped over that. It's hard to talk about Simone Weil, and maybe you'll see by the end of this if I can do a decent job. She is like the universe, and yet she's also very grounded in particular moments in her very short life. She receives her bachelor's degree at age 15. She was at the École Normale Supérieure in France, in Paris, an exclusive school for training teachers. There were only, they accepted only 11 students, and she was one of only 2 women. The other one was Simone de Beauvoir. So she got through the school, gets her first teaching job at a, Le Puy, I think, in France. And she begins teaching, and she completely ignores the requirements of the curriculum and grading and such like that. Well, she has me right there, right? So good for you. She said, "This isn't about learning. All this other stuff you're doing, I just want the students to learn." They're like, "Well, yeah, but we have to, you know the line, you know the response. You have to fit into the machine, right? You are in the machine. You are a part of it. You must play your part." She's like, "Well, no." In fact, she would go out in the fields with the workers when she wasn't teaching. So she was in a remote farm region, and she would go out in the fields and work with the workers and teach them Aeschylus and Plato and read to them the Iliad and talk to them about it. She didn't rest well within the institution of the education. And so she finally just quits after a couple of years, and she takes a job at the Renault auto plant. Now, it would be easy to dismiss Simone Weil as a wild-eyed, bleeding-heart liberal because she had those notions, and if we had some of her colleagues from the Spanish Civil War, they would probably agree. But here's the thing about her. She stayed open. We talk about this a lot at this institution and in these classes. Staying open, not resting on a single position, but staying open to what the universe can teach you, to what the world can teach you, to what other people can teach you, and she did that. And so she gets this job. She quits her teaching job to the distress of her forbearing parents. She starts working at the auto plant. And she imagined, in her idealistic way, that what would happen is at lunch, the workers would gather at lunch and they would talk about Marx or other great issues. And then they would go home at dinner and maybe they'd invite her and they'd have a glass of wine and discuss Plato or Prometheus, talk about Prometheus, the symbol of Prometheus. Well, obviously, we all know it's not like that, right? When you work for a living, you don't get that luxury. The work takes life from you, especially factory work. especially factory work in the early 20th century. So she realized, oh my God, my ideals were just so naive and inaccurate, because she's there doing the stamping, with the machines, and the bosses are being bosses, and they're being terrible and harassing the workers. And she said she could feel the life drain from her. Because when that happens, you don't have time for reflection. You're just trying to stay alive, right? Your mind is not fertile. It's been hammered all day by the sounds of the industry. Thank you, Wendy. Yes. And you got nothing left. You got nothing, no time to reflect. You're just trying to rest until the next day starts again. And you're trying to keep yourself fed and your family fed. Well, this was very profound for her. It's also at this time that she begins getting incredible migraine headaches. She was not well all her life. And who knows, there's a whole cottage industry of diagnosing Simone Weil, which I'm not really interested in. I'm more interested in what she had to say. But, she does get very ill at this point, and she's not been well her whole life, as you'll see. So right now, she goes to Spain and joins the Loyalists. And like I said, these are hardened soldiers fighting for their country. And like, what are you doing here? You're a girl, a French girl, a Jewish French girl, which she utterly rejected. What are you doing here? And she's like, well, I want to help. I believe in the cause. And they're like, will you just please not don't pick up a gun, would you? And sure enough, she was wandering around. You can see her thick glasses, and she couldn't see right in front of her. And they had a cooking pot there, and she stepped in it and burned her leg terribly. So they're like, oh God, will you please go home? And she did. Her parents came to get her, as they often did. And so it was a pathetic end. It was an anticlimax to her great, fighting in the Spanish Civil War. I kind of love her for that, that she wasn't a hero. She just tried to follow her ideas and ideals, and it didn't work, except maybe if it did in a bigger picture, right? So then she has a mystical experience of Christ. This is not the experience you might be expecting. So here are her words. In a moment of intense physical suffering, so this is probably the migraine, but there were other things that she suffered from. When I was forcing myself to feel love, but without desiring to give a name to that love, I felt, without being in any way prepared for it, because I'd not read any Christian writers, especially mystical ones, a presence more personal, more certain, more real than that of a human being, though inaccessible to the senses and imagination. Let me read that again, because it is the turning point of her life. In a moment of intense physical suffering, again, we could stop right there, right? Because that's when the sacred opens to us, almost always. Not exclusively, but almost always. The sacred opens to us during intense suffering. When I was forcing myself to feel love. Okay, we could spend a long time on that. But without desiring to give a name to that love. I was forcing myself to feel love, but I didn't want to name it. All the themes of Simone Weil's work are in every sentence she writes. This is what I think is genius about her, and we're going to see how this plays out. She doesn't want to name something, because to name it is to constrain it, is to limit it, right? She won't do it without in any way being prepared for it. She didn't know what was coming, but she was open to it. A presence. Notice she doesn't say a being, it's a presence, but it's personal, so it's not this disconnected, embodied or disembodied thing. It is personal. More certain. This is a woman who had studied and loved Plato and knew ancient Greek and knew the traditions of Greece and philosophy, but this, she says, was certain. And if you know anything about the history of philosophy, much of it is about the pursuit of certainty. And it fails, by the way. There, you don't have to take any other philosophy courses, I'll tell you. They all fail. But this, for her, was certain. This experience, more real than that of a human being, though inaccessible to the senses and the imagination. And what happens is, I should back up. She actually had an experience before this. I believe she was in Portugal. And she sees this Catholic celebration of a particular saint. I forget who it was. And she's watching them. And she's like, wow, what a bunch of slaves. Right? What a bunch of slaves. And then shortly after that, she's now having this experience. And she's confused, as one should be, by a religious experience. A religious experience takes you out of the ordinary, and so you don't know where you are. And so she had some helpers there, a friendly priest. She ends up praying in the Cathedral of St. Francis, the Chapel of St. Francis. And so she's starting to be inducted into Catholicism, and there's a great friendly priest there who gives her George Herbert, the 17th century English poet, and the poem Love. And here it is. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back. Love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back. Guilty of lust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack, from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful? Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. But love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it does deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. And so I did sit and eat. This poem became her mantra, if we may mix religious metaphors. And she says this: I used to think I was merely reciting a beautiful poem, but without my knowing, the recitation of it had the virtue of a prayer. So we're going to come back to this again. She considers literature as sacred as any biblical text or any sacred text from any tradition. Okay, so she ends up in England after this, and now she has a renewed, well, I even hesitate to say Christian identity, because she utterly refused to be baptized. She was friends with a priest, and that's how we get much of her work. And they have long conversations, and she's like, yeah, I don't want to be part of your institution, because the experience I have had is too large, and that I'm having is too large to fit into your institution. And so I'm not going to be baptized. And maybe that means I'm not a Catholic. If that's how you want to define it, fine. But I am a follower of Christ because I have experienced him. So yeah, she ends up in England, and she's still restless. She wants to help. By now it's World War II, and her beloved France is under siege, and she tries to get Charles de Gaulle to let her parachute into France to help the resistance. And he says, there is no way I am doing that. You can't even see. And you're sick, and you're small, and you're a theologian. You know, what am I going to do with a theologian parachuting into occupied France? But, you know, you got to love her. Yes, she does. Christ-inspired spunk. In May 1941, she finally relents to her parents, who had been urging her for a long time to leave. It's Europe. It's 1941. It's a good time to go, especially if you have Jewish heritage, even though you don't acknowledge it or embrace it. Other people don't care whether you acknowledge it or embrace it. So she set sail for America. So this is from one of her letters to her Catholic priest friend. Do you think the sea might serve me as a baptismal font? Really? You're writing this to a priest? A Catholic priest who has very specific ritual for baptism, very specific meaning. She's like, well, do you think crossing the Atlantic Ocean, is that a baptism? She hated America, despised it, because America was fairly secure at the time, for white people especially, but in the midst of war, we were not yet at war. When she arrived, it was May 1941. And so she just said, I can't, I've got to go back. And she does. She finally returned to England, where she kept trying to get back to France. And right on August 24th, 1943, she died. And it was because, well, again, there's a whole cottage industry of why she died. You will hear tuberculosis, and that's probably true, but she also refused to eat because her countrymen and women were at war, and she didn't want to consume her ration if they didn't have their rations. And so she died. She pretty much starved herself to death, which is interesting because eating is, as you already heard in the passage, it's one of the primary metaphors she uses. She says this, eating, and she does this. I'm going to give you a few metaphors that she uses that reappear constantly. Eating is one of them, and she's always doing the as above, so below relationship. So she says that eating here below, what one eats is destroyed. It is no longer real. All right, so it's an act of destruction. But there's a different kind of eating that you already heard in the passage. There's a kind of sacred dimension to eating where it's not destruction, it's a rebirth. It's a metamorphosis, right? Here's what she says. And again, her writing is very dense and good. We want to get behind the beauty, but it is only a surface. It's like a mirror. Beauty is like a mirror that reflects to us our own desire for good. It is a sphinx, an enigma, a sorrowfully irritating mystery. Sorrowfully irritating mystery. We want to feed on it. Beauty. But it is only an object we can look on. It appears to us from a certain distance, and this is another important metaphor for her, is distance. The great sorrow of human life is knowing that to look and to eat are two different operations. Only on the other side of heaven, where God lives, are they one and the same operation. That's the higher level of eating. To look is to eat. And here, she'll explain it here. Children already experience this sorrow when they look at a cake for a long time and nearly regret eating it, but are powerless to help themselves. Maybe the vices, depravities, and crimes are nearly always, or even always, in their essence, attempts to eat beauty. To eat what one can only look at. Eve initiated this. If she lost our humanity by eating a fruit, the reverse attitude, looking at a fruit without eating it, must be salvation. God is the bread, again, an old metaphor, but she puts it to new uses. The danger is not lest the soul should doubt whether there is any bread, but lest by a lie, God, so substitute God for bread. The danger is not lest the soul should doubt whether there is any bread, but lest by a lie it should persuade itself that it is not hungry. It can only persuade itself of this by lying. For the reality of its hunger is not a belief, it is a certainty. So think about this. Think about yourself at a different stage, because you wouldn't be here tonight if you were not in a different place. Think about a time in your life, or maybe even people you know, who aren't hungry. They are, right? And you were. You just hid it. You lied about it. Let me read it again now. The danger is not lest the soul should doubt whether there is any bread, but lest by a lie it should persuade itself that it is not hungry. Think of the industries we've created, the efforts we've made to tell ourselves, to manufacture and sustain this lie that we are not hungry. We are hungry. But if we can just inoculate ourselves, numb ourselves, eat something, some more sugar, right? Eat something that's not going to last. It's going to give us a high, but not last. Maybe we'll forget our hunger. The reality of the hunger is not a belief, it's a certainty. Looking. Fascinating. I don't know of any other theologian, philosopher who does what she does here with these basic metaphors, but she stretches them into infinity. Religion is looking, she says. It should also be publicly and officially recognized that religion is nothing else but a looking, she says. Remember earlier, she equates looking with eating when we're in the sacred realm. To look is to consume, because there's no separation between the desire and the thing, right? That's what it means to be in heaven, is there's no separation between the desire and the object. She says this: one of the principal truths of Christianity, a truth that goes almost unrecognized today, and I might add a truth that no other Christian had ever thought of, then or since, is that looking is what saves us. It's the looking that saves us. The bronze serpent, do you remember this? The bronze serpent from Exodus? The children of Israel are messing up again, and they get bitten by these serpents, and God says, Moses, what I do again, he says it again. And God says, put a bronze serpent up on a cross, basically, and have the people look at it, and they'll be healed. What, Charlie? To the caduceus. Yeah, that's right. So this is what she's talking about. And one of the principal truths of Christianity, a truth that goes almost unrecognized today, is that looking is what saves us. The bronze serpent was lifted up so that those who lay maimed in the depths of degradation should be saved by looking upon it. To look is to see is to desire. In what she calls this created world, those are separate. But in God's world, they're the same. The great error of the Marxists, she says, obviously she begins as a Marxist, very concerned with the bourgeoisie, of which she was one, and the poor, the proletariat, but she moves away from it. The great error of the Marxists and of all of the 19th century, okay, all of it, was to believe that by walking straight ahead, one had mounted into the air. That's a succinct and telling analysis of the 19th century that I've ever read. They really thought that because they had adopted the metaphor of evolution. And evolution is a straight line if you look at it culturally. And we're just going up and up and up. So if we just keep walking, we'll go up into the air. right? We were very happy with ourselves in the 19th century. And then World War I happened, and we were really confused and hurt. What we really want is above us, not ahead of us. And we cannot take a single step toward heaven. It is not in our power to travel in a vertical direction, she says. If, however, we look heavenward for a long time, God comes and takes us up. We are free only to change the direction of our glance. We cannot walk into heaven. We cannot rise without being lifted by grace. And grace is another one of her categories that we'll get to here in just a second. Gravity is another. Actually wrote a piece one time called Gravity and Grace, and I didn't know about Simone Weil. But so obviously she's brilliant to compare the two. Gravity, in the beauty of the world, brute necessity becomes an object of love. Again, there's a sentence we could spend all night on. In the beauty of the world, brute necessity becomes an object of love. What is more beautiful than the action of gravity on the fugitive folds of the sea waves or in the almost eternal folds of the mountains? This is another theme you're going to see from her, is not to run from contradiction, but to embrace it. Or if you're going to run right into it. Run right into the middle of the contradiction and see what's on the other side. Grace. The universe where we are living and of which we form a tiny particle, this is really important, is the distance put by love between God and God. I know. This is not nighttime reading. This is like, okay, wait a minute, what? Let me say it again. This universe where we are living and of which we form a tiny particle is the distance put by love, not by evil, not by hate, put by love between God and God. We are a point in this distance. Space, time, and the mechanism that governs matter are the distance, right? The universe as we know it, its laws, its features, its chaos and collisions, right? Space, time, and mechanism that governs matter are the distance. Everything that we call evil is just this mechanism. There's no animating force behind it. It's just this mechanism. God has provided that when his grace penetrates to the very center of a person and from there illuminates all her being, she is able to walk on water without violating any of the laws of nature. God has provided that when his grace penetrates to the very center, the person can walk on water without violating any of the laws of nature. When, however, a person runs away from God, he simply gives himself up to the law of gravity. You accede to the mechanism. Then he thinks that he can decide and choose, but he's only a thing. He is now a stone that falls. That's right, isn't it? I mean, if you give yourself up to the mechanism, if you don't strive to find meaning, then you become the mechanism. You're indistinguishable from the mechanism. If we examine human society and souls closely with real attention, we see that wherever the virtue of supernatural light is absent, everything is obedient to mechanical laws as blind and as exact as the laws of gravitation. To know this is profitable and necessary. Those whom we call criminals are only tiles blown off a roof by the wind and falling at random. Wow. Those whom we call criminals are only tiles blown off a roof, part of the mechanism. Their only fault is the initial choice by which they became tiles. Wow. The love of God. If still persevering in our love, we fall to the point where the soul cannot keep back the cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You know this phrase, right? The last saying of Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? She says, if we get to that point where we cannot help but cry, why have you forsaken me? And if we remain at this point without ceasing to love, if we continue to love, we end by touching something that is not affliction, not joy, something that is the central essence, necessary and pure, something not of the senses, common to joy and sorrow, the very love of God. These are hard sayings, but beautiful ones. And in fact, well, let's go to the next one. Affliction is maybe the most important concept for Simone Weil. Goddess knows she certainly experienced it, affliction. And she wants to distinguish between suffering and affliction, because everyone suffers, but perhaps not everyone is afflicted. That deepest wound given by the mechanism, by the universe, maybe a human being, but it's a human being part of the mechanism. Extreme affliction, listen to this language. Extreme affliction is a nail whose point is applied at the very center of the soul, whose head of the nail is all necessity spreading through space and time. All necessity spreading through space and time, but the point of the nail is come to you. It's the weight of the universe on you. He whose soul remains ever turned toward God, though pierced with a nail, finds himself nailed to the center of the universe, at the intersection of creation and creator, at the intersection of the arms of the cross. On the cross, well, let me read this. Affliction makes God appear to be absent for a time. Certainly. More absent than a dead man. More absent than light in the utter darkness of a cell. A kind of horror submerges the whole soul. And during this absence, there is nothing to love. What is terrible is that if in this darkness where there is nothing to love, the soul ceases to love. See the contradiction? There's nothing to love, but you must keep loving. If you don't, God's absence becomes final. The soul has to go on loving in the emptiness, or at least go on wanting to love, though it may be only with an infinitesimal part of itself. Then one day, God will come to show himself to this soul and reveal the beauty of the world. Again, I love this because the revelation is not truth. It's not some ethical code, it's beauty. God will reveal the beauty of the world to this soul, as in the case of Job. But if the soul stops loving, it falls, even in this life, into something almost equivalent to hell. The cross. On the cross, deceit is no longer possible. This is that cross she was talking about, the nail in your soul with the weight of the universe spread out across the universe. We're forced to recognize as real what we would not even have believed possible, but we must recognize it as real. Have you been there? I've been there a lot. Where something happens to you and it's not real. It can't be real. This didn't happen, but it did. We couldn't believe it possible, but it did. And we yield ourselves in love to this event. We yield ourselves in love to this event. To spiritual poverty. So again, see, this stuff is not, everything resonates up for Weil. We yield ourselves in love to spiritual poverty. So the poverty she saw is a religious, sacred poverty. It's not just, that's why she had to leave marks behind. It's not materialism. It's spiritualism. Spiritual nudity. To death itself. We must give up all this, even to the point of provisionally renouncing the hope of immortality. You see why she could never join the church. Right? We must provisionally renounce the hope of immortality. We are ready for the final gesture of obedience, the surrender of the last vestiges of selfhood. Mm-hmm. Introduction, Leslie Fielder. I can, yeah. It's the Fielder introduction, and I'll pull it up for you. Yeah, I have it right here on my desktop. We must yield ourselves. Okay, so remember where we are. We're at a point where we're suffering something we could not even imagine. Just could not even imagine it. And now it's dawning on us that it's real. We must give ourselves up to this thing, to this unreal thing. We must submit to it. It is the final gesture of obedience, and we must even renounce our possibility, the hope of immortality. We must renounce that. We must give up this selfhood there. This is not new. This is Jung, right? This is Joseph Campbell. This is all great teachers of wisdom, really. Is that self that you cling to, that I cling to, that I'll fight for, that I'll defend. It's got to go. My friend Pramangang, a Buddhist monk, used to say, no self, no problem. Weil says, in the ultimate nuptial yes, we must decreate our egos, offer up everything we have ever meant by I. Damn. So that the divine love may pass unimpeded through the space we once occupied. To close again on itself, we are created for this consent, to give up everything we thought was I. We are created for this and for this alone. You may have recognized there the nuptial yes. At its highest teaching, wisdom is sexual, in the sense that it's about union. And so sex as intercourse becomes really the kind of perfect metaphor for what's happening. Other Christian mystics knew this and used it. Okay, almost done here, and I'll let you get in here. We cannot take, so walking's another metaphor of hers that I like. The infinity of space and time separates us from God. That's the mechanism, right? How are we to seek for him? How are we to go toward him? Even if we were to walk for hundreds of years, we should do more than go round and round the world. Even in an airplane, we could not do anything else. We are incapable of progressing vertically. We cannot take a step toward the heavens. God crosses the universe and comes to us. God crosses the universe and comes to us. So what are you supposed to do? Look, wait, give yourself up. Divine love crossed the infinity of space and time to come from God to us, but how can it repeat the journey in the opposite direction, starting from a finite creature? When the seed of divine love has placed in us, when the seed divine love has placed in us and it's grown and become a tree, how can we who bear it take it back to its origin? How can we repeat the journey made by God when he came to us in the opposite direction? How can we cross infinite distance? It seems impossible, she says, but there's a way with which we are unfamiliar. We know quite well in what likeness this tree is made. Another metaphor. This tree that has grown within us, this most beautiful tree where the birds of the air come and perch. We know what is the most beautiful of all trees. No forest bears its equal. Something still a little more frightful than a gibbet, that which is the most beautiful of all trees. It was the seed of this tree that God placed in us, without our knowing what seed it was. If we had known, we would not have said yes. If we'd been asked, we would have refused. It is this tree that has grown within us and become ineradicable. Only a betrayal could uproot this tree. Again, another nail metaphor. When we hit a nail with a hammer, the hole of the shock is received by the large head of the nail as it passes into the point without any of it being lost. None of the force is lost, although it is only a point. If the hammer and the head of the nail were infinitely big, it would be the same. The point of the nail would transmit this infinite shock at the point to which it was applied. Extreme affliction, which means physical pain, distress of the soul, and social degradation as well, all at the same time, is a nail whose point is applied at the very center of the soul. And then she goes into the quote I gave before. He whose soul remains ever turned toward God through the nail, though the nail pierces it, finds himself nailed to the very center of the universe, right? It is the true center. It's not in the middle. It is beyond space and time. It is God. In a dimension that does not belong to space, that is not time, that is indeed quite a different dimension, this nail has pierced cleanly through all creation, through the thickness of the screen, separating the soul from God. And here we are now at our passage, so let's revisit it now that you know what you know. The beauty of the world is the mouth of a labyrinth. The unwary individual who, on entering, takes a few steps is soon unable to find the opening. Worn out, with nothing to eat or drink, in the dark, separated from his dear ones and from everything he loves and is accustomed to, he walks on without knowing anything or hoping anything, incapable even of discovering whether he's really going forward or merely turning around on the same spot. But this affliction is as nothing compared to the danger threatening him. For if he does not lose courage, if he goes on walking, it is absolutely certain that he will finally arrive at the center of the labyrinth, and there God is waiting to eat him. Later he will go out again, but he will be changed. He will have become different after being eaten and digested by God. Afterward, he will stay near the entrance so that he can gently push all those who come near to the opening. What are the ways to wisdom in Simone Weil? Basically every sentence she ever wrote. And she didn't write that much, actually. She wrote one book during her lifetime, and it was on oppression and liberation. What we are reading tonight are gatherings of her letters and essays that were published in very small, unknown journals or written to her Catholic priest friend or others. They've been gathered together under various names and rubrics and themes. In fact, her Catholic friend that she wrote to so often, the one she said, well, maybe crossing the Atlantic is baptism, Father Perrin, gathered some of her work into Gravity and Grace. And, there's not much anti-Catholic in there. Okay, he's a Catholic priest, he's going to do that. But I think this is perfect for Simone Weil because she is so large. She contains multitudes, as Whitman says, that you can pretty much do that. You can make her a Marxist. You can make her a Catholic, although she would have resisted that. You can make her a philosopher, a mathematician. I didn't share it with you, but she loves mathematical analogies, and of course, no doubt that comes from her brother's influence. But the ways to wisdom. Paradox and extreme language. And I'm borrowing a couple of these categories from Leslie Filder because I think he gets it exactly right. Remember our old friend Soren Kierkegaard. Paradox is not a concession, it's a category. It's how you think. It's not what you avoid in thought. It is how you think. It is through paradox that you find the truth. Kierkegaard would say that you find God. So would Weil, but with a very different notion of God than most of us would recognize. She says this, paradox and extreme language. It's like Kabir's upside down poems, right? From last week. She says this, he who gives bread to the famished sufferer for the love of God will not be thanked by Christ. He has already had his reward, just in this thought itself. Jesus kind of says the same thing. You already have your reward. Christ thinks those who do not know to whom they are giving food, or ineluctable necessity, misery, distress, the crushing weight of poverty and of the work that drains the spirit, cruelty, torture, violent death, constraint, terror, sickness, all of these are God's love. Ineluctable necessity, misery, distress, the crushing weight of poverty and of work that drains the spirit, of which she knew. Cruelty, torture, violent death, constraint, terror, sickness, which she had, all of these are God's love. Evil is the beautiful obedience of matter to the will of God. Every time I think of the crucifixion of Christ, she says, I commit the sin of envy. Yeah. The whole thing? He who gives bread, start there. He has, well, of course I can't find it now. Oh, it's the last part. I see, sorry. Evil is the beautiful obedience of matter to the will of God. Evil is the beautiful obedience of matter to the will of God. There's also this sense of equilibrium. So this is probably a terrible analogy, but in post-structuralism, there are these binaries, right? Because language operates according to binaries, but it's not a level binary. Light and dark, good and evil, male and female for that matter. There's always a hierarchy to the binary, right? Not so in Simone Weil's mysticism. So she walks right into these contradictions, these difficult, heart-wrenching contradictions. You just heard it. She walks right into it, and yet she keeps a balance between them. One must accept all opinions, she wrote, but then arrange them in vertical order at appropriate levels. Best of all exercise for the finding of the truth is the confrontation of statements that absolutely contradict one another. She sees a direct contradiction. She sees Aristotle, you know Aristotle's logic. The logic is A cannot be not A in the same time and same sense. She said, oh, that sounds really interesting. Let me explore that. Method of investigation, she wrote, as soon as one has arrived at any position, find the contrary position and make it true. A case of contradiction, she says, both of them true. There is a God, there is no God. Where's the problem? I'm quite sure that there's a God in the sense that I am sure my love is no illusion. I'm quite sure that there is no God in the sense that I am sure that there is nothing which resembles what I conceive when I say the word God. And myth, one of her best pieces is on the Iliad, where she completely reads the Iliad like no one else ever did. In fact, the classical scholars kind of dismissed her for it. She reads the Iliad as an epic poem where the hero is not a person but a force, but force itself. Force is the hero of the Iliad. Listen to this. The true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad is force. Force employed by man, force enslaving man. And that's so right, isn't it? In the Iliad, it's like you exercise force and then force is exercised upon you. Force is the hero, not you, not Achilles, not Ajax. Force employed by man, force that enslaves man, force before which man's flesh shrinks away. In this work, at all times, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relation to force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it could handle, as deformed by the weight of the force it submits to. Wow. That's right. I think that's exactly right. If you've ever read the Iliad, you keep trying to find heroic people, and Achilles is a jerk. I hate Achilles. Screw that guy. He's no hero. And the others, even Hector. No, you're all got your problems, and you're all vain, and all you want is this glory after you're dead. That's really dumb. The hero of the Iliad is force itself. It's the most powerful thing. Even when we use it, it uses... Anyway, all right, I got to close. Stop. So the exposition of myths, she's brilliant at. And then finally, I would say waiting. Obviously, waiting for God. And what's called for here is not just waiting. She has a very specific term for it in Greek and French. Let me just read her. Attention consists of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, ready to be penetrated by the object. It means holding in our minds, within reach of this thought, but on a lower level and not in contact with it, the diverse knowledge we have acquired, which we are forced to make use of. All right, so attention consists in suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. Holding in our minds within reach of this thought, but on a lower level and not in contact with it, the diverse knowledge we've acquired in our life. Our thoughts should be in relation to all particular and already formulated thoughts, as a man on a mountain who, as he looks forward, sees also below him, without actually looking at them, a great many forests and plains. Above all, our thoughts should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to penetrate it. Simone Weil. Thank you for your attention.